Hello everybody and welcome to this, the final event in the Orkney Storytelling Festival 2020. And have we got a show for you tonight? Have we got a show for them tonight? We do. Yeah, have we got a show for you tonight? We have brought together all our friends, our storytellers from the committee and storytelling friends. And we've also got a little taster of what is hopefully coming up next year with our guest storytellers, and Hunter and Mio Shudo. And so it'll be a wonderful cornucopia of stories and song, and I really hope that you enjoy yourselves. So sit back and just listen to the stories.
Hello, Orkney. My name is Mio Shudo. I would like to tell you a story from Japan. This is about tea. 昔々, long time ago, there was a tea master called Rikyu. He used to host many tea ceremonies, and he had many apprentices. One day, one of his students invited him for a tea party. Well, Ricky was delighted because this was his first time anyone has invited him for a tea ceremony. So he asked his students, and they all went to the tea room. Chikuon was his name. Bamboo hat. That's what it means. He had a bamboo hut in the corner of his garden, and that's where he set up the tea ceremony. He woke up early in the morning, and he shook some branches of trees, and maple leaves landed on the ground. And he cut his plants and flowers, so beautiful. One after another, they entered the tea garden and bowed to get into the tea room. I will tell you about the tea room. Usually, tea room has a little entrance, really small, like a hobbit hole. Ricky made this tea entrance because samurai, emperors, everyone have to bow to get inside the tea room. Even samurai warriors, they have to leave their weapons outside of the tea room so that they will bow to get inside. Symbolically, it means that only you come inside the tea room, so that we are all equal as human beings inside the tea house. No matter what we do, no matter where we are from, and our color of the skins and languages we speak, we are all equal as human beings. Chikuan was very excited because this was his first tea ceremony, and his hand was shaking. He picked up the teaspoon, and he was shaking. His master is here. His friends are here. And he dropped the teaspoon. Oops! Seeing this, his friend giggled. Look at Chikuan. He dropped the teaspoon. However, the Rikyu, the master, remains a silence. And next, Chikuan lifted the heavy tea pot, and he tried to pour the hot water into the tea bowl, but he spilled it. Oops! He spilled the hot water onto the tatami mat. tatami mat is made of grass. So, seeing this, his friend giggled. Look at Chikuan, he spills hot water. However, the tea master, Ricky, remained his peace. And ceremony went on, and people enjoyed. Well, he picked up the tea container, and Chikuan opened the top of the container, and he couldn't resist. The biggest sneeze came out from his mouth. Achoo! As you can imagine, the tea, the green matcha tea powder, went everywhere scattered around. Oh, look at us! Students giggled. We are all covered with green tea powder. But Sir Ricky the master remained his harmony. And then, in the end of the tea ceremony, Ricky the master, he bowed very deeply to Chikuan and said, Chikuan, thank you for inviting us all for tea ceremony. You are the best teamer in the whole world. What? Students jumped because how our teacher could tell such a lie? Chikuan dropped the teaspoon and he spilled the hot water onto tatami mat. Not only that, he had the biggest sneeze. Achoo! Look at us, we are all covered in green tea. And they said goodbye to each other on the way back home. One of the students asked the master, Master, why did you lie? Chikuan is the best teaman in the whole world. He dropped the teaspoon and he spilled the hot water and he had the biggest sneeze. Kshoo! Look at us, still green all over. And the master said, well, everybody, I will tell you, the most important thing in the tea ceremony is. So here is a question for you. What do you think is the most important thing in the tea ceremony? I'm sure you have some ideas, and those are all good, great answers. But at that time, 350, 400 years ago, Ricky said to them, the most important thing in the Japanese tea ceremony is simply you make a cup of tea from your heart to your families and friends and people who you meet for the first time. And everything else follows next. So, thank you again. I hope you have a lovely festival, and I look forward to seeing you all next year. Sayonara!
Hello, Orkney Storytelling Festival. I look perhaps like I could be in Orkney, but in fact I'm in Edinburgh doing a bit of spinning. And I've got a story for you, which in fact is from Germany rather than from Scotland. A long time ago, I lived for a while in Germany. And this is the story. La 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 la. Once, long ago, there was a poor widow who had 7 children. 7. All little boys. After her husband died, she was so heart-sore. But she had to keep going. So every evening when the boys went to sleep, she sat long into the night, spinning wool, trying to keep the wolf from the door. But it was difficult. And the day came when she had not a penny in her purse. She had no money to pay the rent, and the landlord, he threw her out. And there she was, a poor widow, wandering through the world with 7 little boys following behind. The day wore on, and they came to a small town, and by now the rain was pouring from the sky, and they had nowhere to sleep that night. But the widow, she went to the burgomaster, and she said, "Your Honour, is there any place, hole or corner in this town where a poor body can find shelter from the storm for herself and her 7 little ones?" He was a kind man. He told her that, yes, there was the old empty palace up yonder, and a grand place it was, and she was welcome to light a fire there. He offered her bread and meat, but he told her that the place had a bad name, that no one had spent a night there without near dying of fright. But the widow said, "What choice do I have? As soon die in a palace as die in a ditch." And she took the bread and meat, and she thanked the burgomaster, and she set off to the palace, along with her 7 little ones. Sure enough, just as the burgomaster had said, it was a grand place. At least it had been. Now, the tapestries hung on the walls in tatters. All the gold-framed mirrors were cracked. Rats had gnawed holes in the wainscots, and moth grubs crawled across the ragged carpets and swarmed in the velvet chair coverings. Great spiders' webs draped across the ceiling, and in every corner there was a scampering and squeaking of mice. But in the kitchen there was a stack of wood, and in no time at all the widow had lit a fire, and they sat by the hearth, and they ate the bread and meat, and they began to feel warm and full and satisfied. And they were just about drowsing off to sleep, when all of a sudden a great wind came roaring through the palace and rattled the windows and banged the doors. Pots and pans fell from the shelves and slid across the floor, and the wind grew fiercer and fiercer, and the banging and rattling louder and louder, and after the wind, an earthquake which lifted the palace from the ground and banged it back down again, throwing the widow and her 7 children halfway to the ceiling and back to the floor, bruised and breathless. And then an immense silence. And then a voice crying out in agony, "Bring me a light! Bring me a light! Bring me a light!" The widow took a burning brand from the fire and gave it to her eldest son, saying, "Go, take this brand to the one who cries so desperately for light. Keep a brave heart, my son, and nothing shall harm you." And her son took the brand and he walked to the kitchen door. And at once his 6 brothers got up and followed him, for they weren't going to let him go alone into heaven knows what danger. They followed the sound of the voice, which still called for light, until they came to a great hall. There, in the middle of the hall, was the ghost of an old, old man, sat in an iron chair. "Bring me that light," he cried. The old ghost's beard was so long that it streamed out across the floor like a great cloud, and under his arm he held a thick book. And the boys, one behind the other, stepped boldly across the hall to where the old ghost sat. "Hold the light steady that I might read," said the ghost. And the eldest boy, holding the brand in both hands, stood close to the old ghost chair, his brothers behind him. And the ghost opened his book and began to read, turning the pages and mumbling and muttering to himself. He read and he read and he read. And the boys stood silently, and the brand burned lower and lower. As the boys watched the flickering flame, they began to wonder what would happen when the flame went out. But just then, the ghost turned the last page, and after he had read it, he clapped the book shut and gave a great sigh. And then he smiled and he said, "My little lads, I am the soul of the rich man who owned this palace. For 100 years I have come here every night after dark. For only after dark was I permitted to come. For 100 years I have cried out for light. For how could I read in the darkness? But only the wind and the earthquake have answered me. In my life, though I did some good deeds, yet I did many evil ones. So when I grew old, I repented of the ill that I had done and vowed to read this holy book from cover to cover. But I put off my reading from day to day, and in the end, death seized me before I had read but a word. What I had vowed to do in life and failed to do, I must do after death. Thus was the judgment given me on the underworld where death had taken me. But now, thanks to you, my little lads, the vow is fulfilled. All is forgiven, and I can go at last to rest in the world beyond worlds. But I will not go without leaving a thank offering for your compassionate help. Run to the kitchen, and there is a loose flagstone in the hearth, under which are 7 jars of gold. The gold is for you and your mother, with an old man's love. And now, goodbye." And with that, the ghost turned into a silvery mist and circled and floated, spiraling up through the ceiling and away, and was gone. And the boys ran back to the kitchen and told their mother everything that had happened. And in no time at all, they had lifted the flagstone, and sure enough, there were 7 large jars of gold. And so, from being the poorest of the poor, the widow and her 7 little boys became the richest folk in all the land. And that's the story of the ghost who cried out for light.
This story I had from a friend of mine, Ian Scott of Redland, sadly no longer with us. But I had it in the mid-90s as part of the Science Festival. We were travelling around vernacular farm buildings, looking at these traditional longhouses in Orkney. And we went to a place called Langalauer. And it was the traditional type of house with neuk beds, which are built into the wall with stone slabs, covering the front, so it narrows the drafts that can get in. And in the room next to it, there was a say bank, a stone shelf that the say, which is the water tub for the house, would sit on. Now, Ian said to me, "Do you know the story about the baby that was born here?" And I said, "No." And he told me this story, and I loved it, and I've been telling it ever since. Now, it was in the late 1700s. There was a family called Corrigal that lived at Langalauer. And the young couple were very happy because the woman was going to have her first baby. So, when it came to the time that the baby was to be born, and the woman went into labour, the howdy wife was called. Now, a howdy wife is a cross between a midwife and a district nurse and an undertaker, because she would take people into the world, she would set bones and make up herbal remedies for people that were ill, and when people died, she would wash and dress the body so that you'd go out of the world nice and decent as well. So she brought you into the world and she sent you out of the world. Now, she went to get some of her friends, some of the other women from the neighbourhood, to help out. And the first thing they did was anything unnecessary in the house was kicked out. So the dog and the husband was booted out the door, not necessarily in that order either. And the man went and he wandered around on the hillside. Now he was trying to pass the time, wandering around with his dog. And he would go back down to the house to see if there was anything happening. And there was a woman who was standing guard in the doorway. And when he came back, she would shake her head and say, "There's nothing happening yet. Away you go." So back up to the hillside and wander around for a while. And he goes back down and the woman in the door says, "There's nothing happening yet. Away you go." So he's wandering around on the hillside, him and the dog, and he's looking at the dog and saying, "Well, do you think we should go back down?" The dog says, "I don't know, I'm a dog." So off he goes down anyway, and the woman in the door says, "There's nothing happening yet. Away you go." So they go and they pace around for a while, and they come back, and the woman's saying, "There's nothing happening yet. Away you go." And he thinks, wait a minute, this woman, she's just getting a bitty bit more drunk every time that he goes down. The last time he went down, she didn't say anything, she just sort of went. Well, he paces around for a while more, and then he comes back, and it's a very different sight that greets him this time. Because there's the woman in the door, and she's in tears. And he says, "What's happened?" And she doesn't answer him. He pushes his way in past her, and there's the howdy wife, and she's washing the blood from her hands, and she says, "Never mind, boy. You're young, you'll have more bairns." "More bairns? What do you mean, more bairns?" Well, the bairn is dead." "Dead?" "Aye." "Oh. Well, maybe it was a thought that crossed his mind in the middle of the night, but it was not one he wanted to think about, and this was not the result that he was expecting." So he said, "Well, what was it?" Pity lass, a daughter. I'd have loved a daughter." Where is she? Where's her body?" "Oh, I put her on the say bank next door." "Well, I want to see her." "You can't." "Why not?" "Well, it's bad luck for a man to see a stillborn child. He'll go sterile, never have any more bairns." "I don't care," he says, "I want to see her." So he pushes his way past the howdy and he goes into the room, and there on that stone shelf there is a tiny little body. Just a tiny wee scrap of humanity. And he looks down at her with the tears in his eyes and a lump in his throat, and he thinks, poor pity thing. She never had a chance. She never got to feel the sun on her face or the wind in her hair or nothing. And then he noticed, wait a minute, the bairn's breathing. So he picked it up, and it had made a slight movement and a wee cry, and he took it through to the other room and he gave it to the mother, and she took it into bed with her and warmed it up, and it came to, and she put it to the breast and it sucked, and it was fine. And then they realised what had happened. You see, back in those days, there was no painkillers, there was no pain relief at all. There was no epidurals, no gas in air, no nothing, not even an aspirin. But what there was plenty of was good, strong, home-brewed Orkney ale. And the woman was fed that to ease the pain. And the howdy wife and the other women, well, they were sociable creatures, and they didn't want to see the poor lass drinking on her own, so they were helping themselves as well. And with the amount of alcohol that was in the woman's bloodstream, it went into the baby. And so when the baby was born, it was paralytic drunk, completely flaked out, not sound, not a movement. Howdy wife, who'd had a few as well, just went, poof, as another did one, poof, and got rid of it. But here it was, fine, absolutely fine. Now, the bairn grew up and immigrated to New Zealand. Now, years and years later, well over 150 years later, in the late 60s it was, there was a knock at the door of the farmer Redland. And Ian Scott's father went to the door, and here was a couple of strangers. And they said, we'd like to look at the old house at Langalow. Oh, sure, he says, no problem, you can see the old house. Well, Langalow are no bother. But why do you want to see it? Well, we had an ancestor that came from there, he said. A young woman, Corrigal to name, emigrated to New Zealand, and married. Ah, right, he said. And he knew exactly who that was. So he took them to the house, he showed them the nook bed, he showed them the say bink, and he said, do you know the story about your ancestor's birth? No, they'd never heard that. So he told them the story, and it was news to them. But then it's hardly surprising, because you see, this was in the period of like the Georgian writers, the Bronte sisters, Jane Austen and all that. Sort of thing that the BBC make costume dramas about these days. Well, it was not a very good opening line to a prospective husband if he said, when I was born, I was so pissed they thought I was dead. I mean, it's not the sort of thing that would hook you a Mr. Darcy, would it? So it was kept quiet in the family. But it was passed down from generation to generation in the parish of Firth, where Langalower stands. And so when that people left Orkney and went back to New Zealand again, they brought with them more than just photographs and souvenirs. They took with them a story of where they came from. And that, my friends, is the power of storytelling.
A ghost story. Well, I must say I don't know if what I'm about to tell you is a ghost story. All I know is that I've had two experiences that I cannot explain. So this happened many years ago. I can't even remember how long exactly. I was travelling to access some off the beaten track archives, and it was one of those journeys that could not be made in one go. I had to stay overnight somewhere. And this sounds like a cliche, I know. I arrived in the late evening in the pouring rain at this very small hotel in the middle of nowhere. It used to be a farmhouse, I think. And the only person I saw when I arrived was the innkeeper. And I remember thinking, oh, this is how ghost stories start.
I am here.
But I was very tired, so I went straight up to my room. And I had a lovely room with a slanted roof, rain thrashing against the roof and the window. I slept very well. Before I went to sleep, I could hear the people in the room next to mine talk for a while. It always makes me feel quite calm and protected when other people are still up when I go to sleep. Much later, I could hear people stumble up the stairs and walk past my room. They were clearly drunk, but I was already half asleep by that point. And the next morning, I was up early. I was the first one downstairs. So the innkeeper approaches with his coffee can and asks me how I'd slept. And I praised his hotel. I said I had a lovely, restful night and I would stay for another week if I didn't have other appointments to tend to. And he looked pleased, but I couldn't quite read his expression. And he said to me that he was happy to hear that I had a good night, but he thought I'd be more frightened having had the whole house to myself the whole night. Now I do remember a night I spent at a friend's house where I was very afraid. There was nothing wrong with the house. It was a lovely house. It was great to see my friends again too. The guest room was in a different wing from the part of the house where they were living. So every night after we'd said our good nights, at the top of the staircase, they would go this way, I would go that way. And this time I knew I was the only one staying in that part of the house. The first 2 nights I slept really well, but the third night something felt wrong. I couldn't sleep. First of all, I went to bed fully dressed, and even though it was a hot summer, I felt like I had to have the duvet up to my nose. You might know that feeling when you don't want your feet hanging off the bed. Everything has to be covered. Very strange. There was nothing that triggered that feeling. It was just a really strange atmosphere. And just as I was about to find some rest, I almost drifted off to sleep when I heard footsteps just going through the corridor where my room was. They creaked past my door and then slowly faded into the house. The next morning, of course, I told my friends, and they had no idea who that could have been. Their housekeeper lived out in the village. So I told myself that maybe the housekeeper had gone for another round to check on all the doors, all the windows, all the candles. But the night after that, I heard it again. And this time I decided I'm going to see who this is, or what this is. So when I heard those footsteps again, I lit the lamp on my bedside table. And as soon as the light was on, those footsteps came to a halt. So I sat there. I was quite frightened. I didn't dare move. I sat there trying to listen. Almost up to the point where you can hear your own blood pounding. And after a while of sitting there in complete silence, I started to doubt whether I had even heard anything. So I put the light out again and tried to go to sleep. But as soon as the light was off and it was dark, the creaking continued. the footsteps went past my door, through the corridor, and then faded into the house. The next morning I told my friends again. I thought they might not know, but they should at least be aware that I hear someone at night in their house. They had no idea. And that same evening, we were sitting on their terrace, overlooking the garden, drinking some tea after dinner. And it was a beautiful bright moon. It was all very nice, a very relaxed atmosphere. And suddenly their son, who was about five at the time, turns up behind us and says, "Mama, I cannot sleep." There was a bit of a back and forth between the boy and the parents. They were saying, "Go back upstairs, we will be with you in a second. Keep the light on." They were trying to reassure the poor boy, but he was refusing to go back upstairs by himself, to the point where it made me a little bit nervous too. And at some point, he said, and this will haunt me for the rest of my life, he said, "The man with the blood in his hair is back again." To this day, I have no explanation for either of these stories, but what I've learned is that sometimes things go bump in the night and you're fast asleep. You're calm, everything seems great, you have no idea. Other times you'll be frightened, you'll be up and you'll feel tense and worried, but you will never know. Now, that's quite enough from me. I shall let you enjoy the rest of the festival.
I am here.
Several years ago, when we did the Orkney Storytelling Festival, we were absolutely delighted that one of our invited guests was an Irish storyteller by the name of Audrey Parks. Unfortunately, Audrey is no longer with us. She's up there somewhere telling stories to the angels. But this was one of the stories that she told, and I hope that you enjoy it. Well, it's an Orkney story, of course. And it involves three farm lads, big, burly Orkney farm boys. And they had fine traditional Orkney names. One of them was called Ireland, one of them was called Thorfinn, and the third one was called Magnus. And one day the three boys were out walking along the lanes, separating their fields, checking on the crops, making sure that the cows were okay. And it was a beautiful sunny day, and there was a lovely warm breeze rippling through the grain, and all was well with the world. But as they walked along, something caught their eye. In the ditch at the side of the road, there was a little sparkle, a little twinkling of light. And they wondered what it was. So they bent down to have a look, and they could see that what they were looking at was a beautiful, perfectly formed spider's web. And it had a little bit of the morning dew still clinging to its threads, and the way that it was just shimmering in the breeze made it sparkle and glitter like some sort of precious jewel. And the three boys were entranced. They were absolutely in awe at the wonder of nature and the beauty of the world. And as they peered down to look at this beautiful little spider's web, a voice, help me, said the voice, and it was coming from behind the spider's web. And the three boys thought, hang on a minute, is this the spider talking? What's happening? And this little voice said, help me, boys, help me, please. And as they looked closer, they could see behind the web a tiny little fairy. Well, they'd never seen the like. In fact, they weren't even sure there were fairies in Orkney. Trowies and hogboons for sure, but a fairy? Well, there she was, and she said, "Help me, boys, please, please help me." "Well, we'll do what we can." And she said, "Please, I am trapped behind the spider's web. I've been imprisoned here by an evil spell. Please help me to be freed from my prison." "Well, of course," they said. "What do we need to do? We can just..." "No," she says, "please, please be careful. If you break so much as a tiny filament or thread of the spider's web, I'll be trapped here forever." And the boys said, "Well, we can't have that." So they bent down and with their big farmer's hands, they prized apart those tiny, tiny gossamer threads until eventually there was a hole just big enough for the fairy to pop out. Oh, she was delighted and she fluttered up around them and she said, "Oh, boys, boys, what a wonderful thing you've done for me. I thought I was going to be trapped there forever. Let me reward you. Let me give you one wish each." Thought the boys, well, this is a good opportunity. The fairy said, "One wish each, boys, so make it count. Make sure it's a good wish." Well, that's quite a lot of pressure. And the boys thought, and they thought, and they thought, oh, a kind of, free fish and chips forever, a never-ending jug of beer, I don't know. Well, after a few minutes, Ireland stepped forward and he said, "I know what I want. I've decided what my wish is going to be." And the fairy said, "Yes, what is it? What is it you wish?" And Ireland, looking very pleased with himself, said, This is my wish, I would like to be twice as wise as I am now." "Woo," said the fairy, "what an excellent wish." And of course the other two were, "Oh, good wish." And the little fairy said, "Now, are you sure that's what you want? You want to be twice as wise as you are now?" "Yep," said Ireland, "that's my wish." So the little fairy fluttered up and she tapped him on the shoulder and she said, "Your wish is granted. You are now twice as wise as you were before." Well, Ireland was just pleased as punch with himself. And the other two brothers, well, that was a good wish. And they thought, and they thought. And Thorfinn said, "I have it. I've decided what I want for my wish." And the fairy said, "Yes, what is it? What is your wish?" And Thorfinn said, "I would like to be 5 times as wise as I am now." Well, the fairy laughed and she said, "That's a very good wish." And of course, Ireland's going, And Thorfinn said, "That's my wish. I want to be 5 times as wise as I am now." And the fairy fluttered up to his shoulder and she tapped him on the shoulder and she said, "Your wish is now granted. You are 5 times as wise as you were before." Well, Thorfinn is absolutely delighted with himself. So it just remains for the third brother, Magnus, to choose his wish. And he thought, and he thought, and he thought about what his brothers had chosen. And he said, "I have it. I know what I want. I've decided what my wish shall be." "Yes," said the fairy. "Yes, what do you want?" Magnus drew himself up and took in a deep breath and he said, "I would like to be 10 times as wise as I am now." The fairy laughed. "Are you sure?" she says. "That's what you want?" "Absolutely sure," says Magnus. "I want to be 10 times as wise as I am now." And the fairy said, "Well, if that is your wish, it shall be granted." And she flew up and she tapped him on the shoulder and she turned him into a woman.
Hello, Orkney Storytelling Festival. I'm sad not to be with you in person this year, but I'm beaming in from Dundee and I'm going to tell you a Dundee story. And it's a story about a wild young man from the city of Dundee. This young man's name was Davy Gray. And Davy never darkened a kirk door in his life. In fact, he was hardly inside at all. He was much more often found running around the estates and the woods and the fields around the edge of the city. And he would always be up to something. He was an expert at poaching some fish or some game, and he always escaped the clutches of the laird's gamekeepers. Davy could run like the wind, and his mind was as quick as his feet. So by the time the gamekeepers figured out that there was something going on, Davy was already back in town and he was selling his fish in the pub, and they never could quite pin anything on him. And every laird around Dundee absolutely hated his guts. They would have been happy to see Davy hanged, but they would have to catch him first. And every time something went wrong, if there was a robbery or if somebody had been caught smuggling, they always tried to pin it on Davy Gray, but they could never get any evidence. So he stayed a free man, and he stayed winding the landlords up for years. But one night, all the lairds from the estates around Dundee were together at a big dinner party, and the gossip was flowing and the wine was flowing. And as usual, the talk turned to Davy Gray and how annoying he was and how they could finally get rid of him once and for all. And the Laird of Kinpurney spoke up, and he had a new idea. He was building a tower on his estate at the top of Kinpurney Hill. And this tower wasn't going to do anything in particular. It was just going to sit there and look rustic and romantic. And at that time, it was the fashionable thing, if you had a nice romantic tower on your estate, was to get somebody to come and live in it as a hermit, because that just was the most rustic and romantic thing of all. Everybody loved coming to look at a hermit. And the Laird of Kinpurney suggested that if they advertised a handsome reward for whoever was to be the hermit of Kinpurney Tower, they thought Davy Gray was likely to give it a shot. And then they could turn it into a true imprisonment. And the other lairds thought this was the best idea any of them had had for a long time, so they all chipped in towards building the tower and towards putting a reward up for the hermit. And soon the Dundee bellman was walking through the streets crying the news. There was a post for a hermit at the new tower of Kinpurney. And the hermit would live there alone for 7 years. And during this time, he would get his food and drink brought to him. And at the end of 7 years, if he could hack it, he would get £100, which was a fortune at that time, and a situation on one of the estates for the rest of his life. And now Davy Gray, he heard the bellman crying this news, and he thought maybe this was his chance to get one up on the lairds himself, or perhaps he was just thinking it was about time for a change of pace in life. So he went up to Kinpurney and he said, "Aye, I'll be your hermit." And he was appointed. And the Laird of Kinpurney took Davy up to the tower, which was to be his home for the next 7 years. And he told Davy to take off the clothes he was wearing, and he handed him a sheepskin, and this rough sheepskin was to be his only clothing. And there was a wee pile of rags on the floor to be his bed. And he was to get a small bit of food and water, but just bread really, and cold water handed into him every day. And there was no fireplace. There was no water for him to wash. And there was nothing to comb or cut his hair. And the laird said even his nails would not be cut for the 7 years he was a hermit. And what's more, if he did see anybody, he was not to speak to them. Now, the lairds hoped that a few months of this lifestyle would be enough to break Davy's spirit and maybe even see him off for good. But Davy Gray actually seemed to take to the life of a hermit really well. He had no fire, but he walked up and down his cell to keep himself warm through the winter. And he could not speak, but he would sing to himself to keep his voice from fading away. And although the laird only gave him cold bread and cold water, Davy did not get downhearted. And soon the fame spread, and people would come from all around to come and see the famous hermit of Kinpurney, the most isolated and the most deprived hermit in Scotland by far. And year after year, Davy kept on going, and he paced his cell and he sung to himself, and his friends from Dundee would come up and they would call through to him, "Keep going, Davy, keep going." And at the end of his 6th year as a hermit, the magistrates of Dundee came out on a day trip to see for themselves because they could not quite believe that he was still surviving. And Davy called out to them, singing through the little hole in his wall, that he would see them all again next year when he got out. And so he did. At the end of his 7th year, to the absolute astonishment and fury of the lairds, Davy Gray was still living and he still seemed quite happy. And everyone who had been there on the night that they made the plan came to see him released. And so did a huge crowd from Dundee who were keen to see what 7 years of total isolation had done to Davy Gray. And there was cheers and whoops as the door was unlocked and Davy staggered out into the first sunlight he'd seen in years. And he had a long beard now straggling down to his knees, but instead of the jet black that his hair had been when he went in, his hair and his beard were now grey. And the nails on his hands and his feet were long and curved like the claws of a seagull. And there were many people in the crowd who had been friends of Davy from the years before, but he looked around and he was blinded by the light and he seemed not to recognise a single face. And then people started to ask him how he was feeling. And Davy's words were strange and stilted, and his voice was weak from lack of use when he spoke. But his voice became strong and clear when he made the sounds of the hill. Davy could caw like a crow, and he could low like a cow. He could sing like a bird, and he could bark like a fox. And he could even perfectly echo the sighing sound of the wind in the trees. These were Davy's words now. He seemed to be somehow less and more than human, like he had become part of the hill itself in those 7 years. But Davy was a hero to the people of Dundee, now more than ever. They thought he'd beaten the lairds at their own game. And he was taken into a coach and he was driven around the streets of the city and he was cheered and welcomed, and people brought him into a comfortable house and he was given help to have a bath and cut his hair and his nails, and even the city's best doctors volunteered to come and help make up a plan to get Davy back eating normally again. They thought after a week or two back in civilization he'd be his old self again. But he seemed to grow weaker instead of stronger the longer that he spent in town among people again. Davy had no appetite for the food and no energy to walk. And language never really came back to him. He avoided talking to other humans whenever possible, but He would often sit by the window and he would make the hill sounds over and over when he was spoken to. Within a year or so of coming out, Davy Gray was a shadow of his former self. And it was not long before Davy contracted a fever. And soon he was gone from the world of men forever. But it's possible that the spirit of Davy Gray is still out there on Kinpurney Hill, in with the winds and the birds and the animals. And that is the story of the hermit of Kinpurney Hill.
Es war einmal ein Müller. Der hatte 3 Söhne, seine Mühle, einen Esel und einen Kater. Once upon a time there was a miller, and he had 3 sons, a donkey, his mill, and a tomcat. The sons worked in the mill, the donkey carried the grain, and the tomcat caught the mice. One night the miller went to bed, and the next morning he was dead. And the oldest son spoke, "The mill is mine now." And for the middle son there was the donkey. He could ride away with it into the wide world. And the youngest son, he got the cat. And he sat down and wept and wondered, what am I supposed to do? I just have that cat. What happens if I get hungry? Shall I eat the cat and then make myself some gloves out of its fur? The cat had heard that. "Listen," he said. "There is no need to kill me and make yourself some shoddy gloves out of my fur. Just give me a pair of boots so I can go out into the world and be seen by the people, and you shall see that you will be helped." "My cat can speak?" the miller wondered. But at that moment, the shoemaker walked by. And the young miller got the shoemaker in, had his cat's hind legs measured, and when the boots were ready, the cat put them on and stood up like a man, and not like a puss. He found an empty bag, collected some grain from the mill, and walked out of the door. Bye. Now at that time, the kingdom was in a state of emergency. The king had become an addict. He was addicted to partridges, and there were plenty of them in the woods, but they had become so shy that the king's hunters just came back empty-handed every time. The cat knew that, and he put the sack with the grain on the forest floor. He opened it up, spread the grain around a little bit, and tied a string at the top of the bag. Then he hid most of the string in the grass and himself behind a hedge. And then he just sat there and waited, lurking. Soon enough, the partridges came and picked around with the grain, and one after the other hopped into the open bag. The cat pulled the string. Meow! and had all the partridges in the sack. He walked to the king's castle, but there the watchman just said, "Halt! Where are you going?" "To the king, meow," said the cat. "Don't be ridiculous, a cat visiting a king." But another watchman came and said, "Let the cat in. You know how grumpy the king has been recently, because of that partridge shortage. Maybe the cat will hop about and do some silly things, and the king will be cheered up." So the cat went straight to the king, gave his reference, and said, "Meow, my master, the Graf, the Duke," and then he said a very long name, "sends you these partridges." The king was beside himself for joy. Finally, partridges! Cook! Prepare them immediately!" And to the cat he said, "You get yourself as much gold as you can carry from my gold store, and bring that back to your master, and give him greetings from me, his majesty, and a big Dankeschön, many thanks for the partridges." At the mill, the young miller was sitting by the window waiting. "That cat, does he ever come back? I've spent my last money on boots for a cat, and now I might never see him again." But at that moment, the cat came in and opened the bag with the gleaming gold and said, "Now you're paid back for the boots. And by the way," while the cat took off his boots, he said, "This gold is from the king. And the king sends his greetings. And I also told the king that you are a duke." The miller didn't know what to make of that, but he was very happy about the gold. And the cat curled up by the fire that night and just said, "You just wait. This is only the first of the gold. I will make you a little bit richer if you wish." And now every day the cat went out, caught more partridges, brought them to the king, and every time the king gave him gold, and that gold the cat brought back to the miller. And the king became very fond of the cat, and he allowed him to prowl all over the castle and come and go as he wanted. The favorite spot for the cat was in the kitchen by the fire. It was nice and cozy there. And one day, the king's coach driver burst in. "Oh, that stupid king, I wish he would suffocate on his partridges. Just today, when I had planned to go to the Wirtshaus, to the pub with my mates and have a few beers and play a bit of cards, no, His Majesty got it in his mind that he wants to drive around, spazieren, with his daughter the princess. He wants to go and visit the lake." The cat had heard that and walked back to the mill and told the miller, "If you want to become a real duke, you'd better come with me to the lake now and have a bath." The miller had no idea what the cat was talking about, but he followed the cat. And when they got to the lake, the cat told him, "Take your clothes off. Get into the water. And the miller did as he was told. He couldn't swim, so he stood in the cold water of the lake, and it rose higher and higher up to his nose. And the cat had taken the miller's clothes away, dug a little hole, put them in and put earth over it. And soon enough, the king arrived in his carriage with his daughter, the princess. The cat jumped out of the bushes and shouted, "Meow! Meow! 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 Help! Hilfe! My master is sitting in the lake and getting very, very, very cold. And thieves have stolen his clothes, so he can't get out and he will die." "Quick, quick," shouted the king. "Servants, get some of my clothes from the castle." And the servants rushed and got the clothes, and the young miller stepped out of the water and put the king's clothes on. He was young and he was handsome, and the princess was quite impressed with what she saw. And the king said, finally, we meet. I never thanked you personally for all the beautiful partridges you sent me. Come sit with us in the coach and let's drive spazieren. Let's have a look around. But where's the cat? The cat had walked ahead, and he had seen the beautiful hay where over 100 people were working, making hay. And then he walked further on and saw an even bigger field with grain where over 200 people harvested. And then he came to a magnificent forest where over 300 people chopped the wood and made some firewood. And the cat knew who was the owner of all this. It was the sorcerer. And he talked to all these people working. "Listen, meow. Soon the king will drive by in his carriage. And when the king asks you, 'Who owns all this?' you answer, 'The Duke, or else.'" The people were very afraid of that strange cat that walked like a man in shining boots. And the cat wandered off until he came to the sorcerer's palace. He knew that sorcerer. He was really an ogre with an ego problem, an ego as big as a cathedral. He walked straight to the sorcerer, gave a reverence, and said, "Meow, sir, I have come to see if it's true what the people say about you, that you are the best sorcerer in the whole world, and you can change yourself into everything you want. I heard that you can change into a dog or a fox or a wolf, but I wonder, could you do something as big as an elephant?" "Of course I can," said the sorcerer, and changed himself into a huge elephant. "Oh," said the cat, "most impressive. But can you do a lion as well?" "Roar! Immediately, the sorcerer was a lion, and the cat pretended to be afraid and hid himself under a sofa. But pretty quickly he peeked out from under the sofa again and said, "But I wonder, can you be a little mouse as well? I've now seen that you are the best sorcerer in the whole world, but surely a mouse is far too small for you to change into?" "Oh, my dear Catty," said the sorcerer, "nothing easier than that." And zzzt, he became a tiny mouse that scurried around in the big hall, and the cat, with one jump, meow, pounced on it and gobbled it up. In the meantime, the king with the princess and the duke was still driving spazieren in his carriage. And he smelled the beautiful smell of that hay. And then they came by the golden grain with many people still harvesting. And then they drove into the magnificent forest. And the king looked around and he asked the people who were still chopping wood, "Who owns all this?" And the people said, "The duke." The king turned to that duke sitting next to him in the carriage and said, "I had no idea, Herr Graf, how wealthy you are. This forest is bigger than my own." And soon they came to the sorcerer's palace. The cat was already waiting at the top of the stairs by the grand entrance. A bit of the mouse come sorcerer's tail was still dangling out of his snout, but quickly sucked it in and said, "Meow! Finally you are here. What an honor that His Majesty comes to visit my master's, the Duke's, abode. This will make my master so happy. He will never be happier ever in his life again." And they all walked together into the grand hall, and the king marveled at all the gold and the silver and the precious stones. And the princess marveled at the young duke. And the duke marveled at his cat and then at the princess. And when the king saw that, he pronounced his daughter's, the princess's, wedding day with the duke there and then. And when the king got old, the duke, who had once been a miller's son, became the new king. And he made his precious cat his first minister. Und wenn sie nicht gestorben sind, dann leben sie noch heute. Miau!
Okay, I'll sing you a Fife song. Those of you who can see the map to my side, Fife is at the very bottom of the map and Orkney's up there at the top in the box. And I didn't actually choose to have the map in this video, it just happens to be in the least messy part of my house. So this is a song written by the great Matt Armour during the 1970s. It's called Generations of Change. My father was a bailie frae a wee place at Capeley. He worked on the ground all the days of his life. By the time he made second, he aye said he reckoned he'd ploughed near on half an east nuke of 5. He feed on at Randerston, Crawhill and Clappington, Cambo and Carnby and Beggar in his Hill. At Kingsbarns he was married, and at Borehills he was buried. And man, had he lived, he'd been ploughing on still. But those days were his days, and those ways were his ways, to follow the plough while his back was still strong. But those days are past, and the time come at last, for the weakness of age to make way for the young. I was nae for ploughing, to the sea I was going, to follow the fish and the fishermen's ways. Rain, hail and sunshine, I watched the long run line, the man mair contented his hale working day. I long lined the Flodden Grand, Dutch in the Dogger Bank, pulled the great fish from the deep Devil's Hole. A side trawled off Shetland and Faroes in Iceland, and weather much war than a body could thaw. But those days were my days, and those ways were my ways, to follow the fish while my back was still strong. But those days are past, and the time come at last, for the weakness of age to make way for the young. Now my sons they have grown, and away they have gone, to search for black oil in the dark northern sea. Like oilmen they walk, and like Yankees they talk, and there's no much in common tween my sons and me. They've roughnecked on Josephine, Fortes and Ninian, Dunlan and Claymore, and Fisher and Dock. They've made fortunes for sure, for on one run ashore they spend mair than I earned in a hale season's work. But these days are their days, and these ways are their ways, to ride the rougher eggs while their backs are still strong. But these days'll pass, and the time come at last, for the weakness of age to make way for the young. Now my grandsons are growing, to the school they are going. The long days o' summer they spend here with me. We walk through the warm days, talk of the old ways, the cornfields, the codfish, the land and the sea. We walk through the fields that my father once tilled, talk to the old men that once sailed with me. Man, it's been awfu' good, I've told them all I could, o' their past and their present, what their future might be. For these will be their days, what will be their ways, what will they make of their land, sea and skies? Man, I've seen off a change, but it still seems gay strange to look at my world through a young laddie's eyes.
This is a tale from Orkney, and I am really pleased that Jennifer Wrigley is going to join me by the magic of modern technology to play the fiddle. It's a tale called Tam Bicken and the Trow. Tam Bicken was a jolly, cheerful, friendly man who lived in Dearness. He liked nothing more than to play his fiddle. Whenever there was a party or a wedding or a wake or a hoolie or a muckle supper, there you'd find Tam, first to be invited, first to rosin up his bow, and often the last to leave. He was oft times to be seen making his way home in the wee small hours, sometimes not too steadily, weaving his way with his fiddle on his back, sometimes humming a tune or thumbing a new tune on the strings. It was one Johnsmas Eve that he was making his way home across Tarracliff Bay, that narrow strip of land that holds Dearness to the rest of East Mainland, when he suddenly saw coming towards him a little old man with a long grey beard and a long grey coat and bright grey eyes. "Good evening, Tam Bicken," said the peaty little man. "And I see you have your fiddle with you." "Good evening," said Tam. "Well," says the old fella, "perhaps you'd like to come and play some tunes for myself and a few friends and for some heather ale?" "Oh," said Tam, "I'd be very happy to come and play tunes for heather ale, I mean for you and your friends." And the old man led the way, back along the sand and up towards the mound of Dingy's How. When they got to the hill, the old man tapped his foot 3 times on a tussock of grass, and a door appeared in the side of the hill and opened wide, and the old man trotted in, and Tam followed him. Down a long, winding, dark corridor they went. Tam was beginning to suspect that this old fellow might be a trow. And out they came into a wonderful underground cavern with a huge, high, vaulted ceiling. And there, splendid, a fabulous great cask of beer. "Sit you down there now, Tam Bicken," said the little old man, "while I pour you a cup of heather ale." Well, Tam took a seat, and the old fella spiked the barrel and turned the little tap and filled a tankard with this beautiful golden amber liquid and handed it to Tam. "Take a sip of that now, Tam," he said, "and you'll never have tasted the like of it before." Well, Tam took a sip. Ooh, and it was wonderful, and warmed him down to his toes. "Well," said Tam, "that's amazing. I've never tasted anything like that before." And he took up his fiddle and struck up a tune. Well, Tam had hardly drawn the first note out of the fiddle when out of the shadows wee folk came dancing. Dozens and dozens of peedy wee folk, all dancing and skipping to the music. Tam played like he had never played before. Dozens and dozens of beautiful tunes came flooding out of the fiddle, tunes he didn't even know that he knew. On and on he played until his fingers were flying over the strings, till eventually the heather ale, like the tunes and the evening, came to an end. "Oh, that was marvellous," said Tam. "Thank you so much." And he shook the peedy man by the hand. And all of a sudden, he woke up, outside the hill, in the cold, damp grass as the dawn was breaking. There was no sign of the door, no sign of the little old man. Tam threw his fiddle over his shoulder, shook himself awake, and set off down the road home. As he approached his house, coming down the road, he started to notice a few things were strange. He didn't remember that tree. He didn't remember that cottage. And when he came to his mother's house, he had a terrible shock. For the garden was grown taller than Tam with weeds, and the roof of the cottage had fallen in. "Mother," he cried, "Mother!" running round the house looking for her, but it was no good. The place was in ruins. Just then, he saw a child coming down the road, and he grabbed him by the elbow. "Where's the woman who lives in this house?" cried Tam. "What's happened?" "I don't know," said the child. "It's always been a ruin." "Come and see my father," he said. He's old. He'll know what's going on. He might be able to remember. Well, along the road there was an old fellow leaning on the wall, an old fellow with silver hair. What's happened to my house? Cried Tam. And who are you? Well, the old fellow looked at Tam very strangely. I am Andrew Doubleday, he said. No, said Tam, I know Andrew Doubleday. He's not much older than me. And then understanding came on the old fellow. Tam Bicken, he cried. You've come back. You've come back. 14 years you've been lost. Well, look at you, and not a day older. 14 years, said Tam. One night I was away. Poor Tam. News of his extraordinary adventure soon spread all over East Mainland. Everybody wanted to see him. Tam Bicken's back, have you heard? Not a day older than when he went away. Even the rosin on his fiddle is the same. Everybody wanted Tam to go to their house and play music. Everyone invited him to parties. Everyone wanted to hear fiddle tunes. Play us a tune, Tam, they'd cry. Play us the tunes they play under the hill in Dingy's How. But Tam didn't want to play at all. He took to going for long walks by himself. He'd be seen many times, wandering alone on the sands, muttering to himself, thumbing strange tunes on the strings of the fiddle that he never quite played. The last time he was seen, he was heading off over the sands one late night towards Dingy's How, and he was never seen again. If you're passing that way on a moonlit night, listen out carefully, and you might just hear the sounds of Tam playing fiddle under the hill. Bless the lamplit in your window, bless the fire in your hearth, bless the folk who love and keep you in the danger and the dark. For there's magic and there's music and there's tales of mystery, tall tales of tall ships and lands beyond the sea. For tales were told at twilight when giants strode our dreams, and humble Jack came stumbling back, his pocket full of beans. And songs were sung at hearthside since the first fire sparked, and a lassie bold spun straw to gold and danced in shoes of glass. The world is full of wonder as the sky is full of stars, and tales unfold yet to be told, and the deeds to come are ours. Bless our tales of ever after, as our days go dancing on from the cradle to the kirkyard, and we dream of coming home.
Well, there you go, folks. There's the 2020 Orkney Storytelling Festival now just starting to disappear beyond the horizon, and let's hope there are brighter horizons to come in the future. My thanks to all our storytellers, to the members of our committee who have done so much work to make this possible, to the storytellers from our committee who have stepped up and filled up this gap in this strange year with their wonderful tales, and also to our friends who have also contributed stories too, and to Anne and Mio who have given you a little taster of what's to come in the Storytelling Festival 2021. And I really hope that we can have a Storytelling Festival 2021 in person, live, because while recording these films is all very well, and we're kind of used with doing things online now, like meetings and such like everything, and just seeing family and friends. Oh, but it's no substitute for the real thing, and storytelling to a live audience. I'm afraid a camera can't do justice for that, because we need you. We need the audience. It's you that gives the atmosphere. It's you that brings the whole magic to life. And so we really hope that next year you can join us here at the Orkney Storytelling Festival. So take care, stay safe, and good night.